around the room you're sitting in right now, listening to my voice, are you absolutely sure you're completely alone? Imagine waking up in the dead of night, looking over at your bedroom door and seeing someone you know, someone you trust, just standing there in the pitch black, staring at you with a psychotic smile. Tonight, I'm going to share 3 true horror stories that will make you second-guess everyone you've ever let into your life. So, let's not waste any time. Grab your headphones, turn the lights down, because after tonight, the dark corners of your own home aren't going to feel safe anymore. Back when I was in high school, I was what you'd traditionally call a nerd. Nowadays, people kind of wear that word like a badge of honor, but back then, it definitely wasn't a term of endearment. For my small circle of friends and me, going to school every day felt like getting repeatedly punched in the gut. High school was just different back then. You could legitimately get beaten up or ostracized just for not listening to the same music or not being into sports. It sounds like a total cliché, but unfortunately, it was our reality. Junior year was easily the absolute worst for bullying. There was this one specific kid named Steve who made it his personal mission to torment us all year long. But towards the end of the second semester, Steve decided he wanted to pull this massive, elaborate prank. He wanted to prove to the entire school how cool and fearless he was, so he came up with a plan to break into the building in the dead of night. Well, as it turned out, Steve wasn't nearly as clever as he thought, because he ended up getting caught red-handed. But before I get into how he got caught, I need to lay down some groundwork about the school itself. The school has been permanently shut down and demolished for years now, but back then it was one of the older, more prominent private academies in our county. We had to wear strict uniforms and attend regular chapel services during school hours. The building itself looked incredibly ancient. Before it was converted into a school back in the 1950s, the property had actually been used as a quarantine hospital for the sick. There was a massive local urban legend surrounding the place. Rumor had it that when they broke ground to build the school's foundation in the 50s, the construction crew dug up tons of skeletal remains. Supposedly, back when tuberculosis was wiping out people in the area, the staff didn't want to risk infection by using public cemeteries, so they just disposed of the bodies in this massive underground tunnel network that connected the main hospital to a nearby ward. Whether those stories were 100% true or just local folklore, they became legendary among the students. The school looked objectively terrifying even in broad daylight. When you're sitting in a classroom and the building is constantly making these weird, unexplainable creaking and groaning noises, it's easy for your teenage mind to just say, "Yep, that's definitely a ghost." In reality, it was probably just an old nuff house of a building falling apart, but the atmosphere definitely played tricks on you. Anyway, back to Steve. The night he broke in, he went completely off the deep end. He successfully bypassed a back window lock, walked inside, and started completely trashing the classrooms. He was ripping papers apart, throwing files all over the place, and he even went into the library and pulled hundreds of books off the shelves. You're probably wondering how exactly he managed to get caught. Well, to top off his little midnight raid, he decided to turn it into a horror movie trope. He went to the art room, swiped a bucket of thick red paint, and started painting terrifying messages across the hallway lockers. He wrote things like, "Get out, your soul is next," and my personal favorite, "Death is coming." But while he was writing these messages on the lockers, Steve claimed that something went horribly wrong. According to the story he told later, he started hearing this bizarre noise coming from behind the heavy wooden door that led down to the basement. Out of pure curiosity, he walked over to the door. When he looked through the small gap at the bottom, he claimed he saw dark shadows moving around in the pitch black, and he could hear voices talking. He said it didn't sound like normal human whispering. It sounded malicious, deep, and completely evil. It terrified him so badly that he dropped his paint and ran out of the school, leaving the back doors wide open. It didn't take long for the administration and the police to match the handwriting on the lockers to Steve's essays. The school board had finally had enough of his nonsense, and they expelled him that very week. I'll never forget the day he was being escorted out of the main office by his parents. He was hysterically crying and screaming at the principal about something evil living in the basement. My friends and I were convinced Steve was just making up a massive lie to try and play the victim card so he wouldn't get in legal trouble. We hated the guy, so in our opinion, he got exactly what he deserved. But the rest of the school started treating him like some sort of folklore hero. For the last week of school, we had to listen to everyone talk about how brave Steve was and how he almost died at the hands of malevolent spirits. During lunch on the very last day of school, I suggested something completely insane to my friends. I looked at them and said, "What if we break into the school tonight? We can make our way down to the basement, prove it's just a normal empty basement, and show everyone that Steve is nothing but a lying punk." My friends were hesitant at first, but the thrill of debunking our bully was too good to pass up. The plan was incredibly straightforward. We break in completely quietly, head straight to the basement, check it out, document it if we could, and leave. If we heard so much as a weird noise, we would run. We weren't going to stick around and get caught like Steve did. We were the ultimate good kids, the nerds, the teachers' pets who actually cared about getting good grades. The faculty trusted us completely. Because of that, nobody in a million years would ever suspect us of doing something like this. I remember that night vividly. Even though it was the start of summer, it was unseasonably cold outside. We all dressed in pitch-black hoodies, sweatpants, and sneakers to blend into the shadows. Looking at ourselves in the mirror, we honestly felt like professional criminals. Getting inside the school wasn't even a challenge. We weren't master lockpickers, but our friend Carson's mom happened to be the night shift custodian for the campus, and she kept a master set of keys at home. Carson had quietly swiped the key to the back entrance earlier that evening, which was honestly 90% of the reason we had the confidence to do this in the first place. It was around midnight when we unlocked the back door and stepped inside. I think anyone who has ever walked through their school after hours knows exactly how unsettling it feels. When a place that is normally bursting with the loud, chaotic energy of thousands of teenagers suddenly goes dead silent, it feels like a graveyard. As the narrow beams of our flashlights cut through the empty hallways and locked classrooms, my stomach did a complete flip. My mind was definitely fighting against all those old urban legends we'd grown up hearing. The fear was entirely psychological, but it was incredibly real. We kept our heads down and made our way to the very back of the building, standing right in front of the heavy, dark wooden door that led to the basement. When Carson turned the key and pushed the door open, a wave of stagnant, freezing, and incredibly dusty air hit us right in the face. Ahead of us was a steep set of wooden stairs leading into a darkness that felt almost solid. Our cheap dollar store flashlights were barely doing anything against it. Carson took the lead, and the rest of us followed closely behind, stepping carefully on the creaking wood. Once we reached the bottom, the basement proved to be a total nightmare environment. There were massive wooden storage crates stacked everywhere you looked. We pried a couple of them open out of curiosity. They were just filled with decades-old textbooks, broken Christmas decorations, and moldy vintage school uniforms. But the absolute creepiest part of the basement was a row of old, discarded religious statues of Jesus and Mary tucked away in a corner. The way their painted eyes seemed to catch the flashlight beams made them look terrifyingly lifelike. I've always been deeply unsettled by old churches and religious imagery, and standing there in the dark, it sent a literal shiver down my spine. We spent about 5 or 10 minutes exploring the area. There were no signs of ghosts, no shadows, and definitely no monsters, but we did realize just how massive this basement actually was. It seemed to stretch out indefinitely beneath the school, far beyond the layout of the floors above it. Our flashlights weren't powerful enough to even see where the walls ended. Eventually, we made our way to the furthest, darkest corner of the entire basement. The moment we stepped into that specific area, the temperature plummeted. It was so cold we could literally see our breath misting in the air. There were several heavy crates piled against the brick wall. We worked together to push them aside, and when we did, our jaws completely dropped. Right there, at the very bottom of the wall, was a hole. It wasn't massive, maybe about the size of a large beach ball or a boulder, but it was just wide enough that a person could easily crawl through if they lay flat on their stomach. Carson shone his light into the opening. It wasn't just a hollow space, it was a long, narrow tunnel built out of old masonry. We all immediately realized what we were looking at. This had to be the remnant of the old 1950s hospital tunnel, the one from the legends where they allegedly dumped the bodies. Carson looked at me and whispered, "Dude, we have to at least crawl a little bit inside. If we want to completely prove Steve was full of it, we have to check the tunnel." None of us wanted to go into that literal death trap, so naturally we decided to play rock, paper, scissors to see who would have to do it, and by some horrible stroke of bad luck, I lost. Not wanting to look like a total coward in front of my friends, I swallowed the massive lump in my throat. I gripped the plastic flashlight tightly, dropped down onto my stomach, and slid my body into the narrow brick tunnel. The space was suffocatingly tight. The walls felt like they were pressing down on me from all sides. I crawled forward about 5 or 6 feet before I completely froze. I thought I heard something. I stopped moving entirely, holding my breath. Out in the basement, my friends were still snickering and whispering. I snapped back at them. "Shut up! Seriously, shut up! I hear something!" They went dead silent. I pressed my ear closer to the dirt floor of the tunnel and listened as hard as I could. Deep within the darkness of the tunnel, there was a sound. It wasn't the sound of the wind. The best way I can describe it is a heavy, rhythmic, whooshing noise, like something large moving very quickly through a confined space. Desperate for reassurance, I gathered every bit of courage I had left and yelled into the dark, "Hello? Is anyone down there?" The second the words left my mouth, that whooshing sound abruptly changed. It morphed into a rapid, low human whisper. It sounded like someone speaking at an incredibly fast pace in a completely distorted, unrecognizable language. The whispering was getting louder, and it was moving directly toward me. And then, total, agonizing silence. Behind me, Carson was whispering, "What's the hold-up, man? Keep going." But I couldn't move a single muscle. My limbs felt heavy and entirely paralyzed by pure terror. Shaking uncontrollably, I raised my flashlight and pointed the beam directly down into the dead end of the tunnel. And what I saw is something that will haunt me until the day I die. Roughly 15 feet away from me, crouched on the floor of the tunnel, was a person. But their posture wasn't human. They were hunkered down completely on all fours like a wild animal. The person was entirely shirtless, and they were so emaciated that their skin was stretched tightly over their torso, making every single rib completely visible. Their hair was a matted, filthy mess, but it was the eyes that completely broke me. As my flashlight beam hit their face, their eyes remained wide open, completely unblinking. They were glassy, milky white, and entirely devoid of any human life. Their mouth was hanging slightly open in this vacant, horrifying grimace. I was paralyzed. I managed to choke out the words, "Are you okay?" There was no response, but the exact moment I tried to slowly shuffle backward to get out of there, the entity violently lunged forward from its crouching position, tearing down the tunnel directly at me. An unnaturally loud, guttural, animalistic screech tore out of its throat. Trying to crawl backward out of a claustrophobic tunnel while watching that pale, skeletal face sprint towards me in the dark was hands down the worst experience of my entire life. I was screaming at the top of my lungs, kicking my legs, scrambling desperately to get my torso out of the opening. My friends were confused at first, but the second I flew backward out of the hole and they saw that filthy, wild human head and a pair of skeletal hands burst out of the opening right after me, they completely lost it. The person tore himself halfway out of the wall and violently reached out, trying to grab my ankle like a rabid animal. We didn't care about our flashlights or our gear. We dropped everything on the dirt floor and sprinted for the stairs. I don't even remember physically running up those steps. It felt like we literally flew up them. We slammed the heavy wooden basement door shut behind us. We could hear the violent thudding of the person throwing themselves against the other side of the wood, but they didn't follow us into the main school. We sprinted out of the building, locked the back door, and ran all the way back to my house without looking back a single time. To this day, I still don't know for sure what we encountered in that basement. I'm a rational guy. I don't necessarily believe it was a literal demonic spirit or the ghost of a tuberculosis victim. Personally, I think the most logical explanation is that the old hospital tunnel connected to the city's abandoned storm drain network, and some severely mentally ill or addicted homeless person had found a way inside and used that pitch-black crawl space as a permanent shelter from society. I still choose to believe that's what it was. But the one thing I can never truly get past is the eyes. I have never seen eyes that empty, hostile, and completely dead on a living human being before that night, and I haven't seen them since. When Steve was being dragged out of the school, crying about an evil entity in the basement, he wasn't lying to save his skin. He had seen the exact same thing we did. A few years ago, the county finally demolished the old school campus.
I actually drove out there to watch them tear down the brick walls. As the excavators leveled the property, I couldn't help but wonder if that narrow brick tunnel is still down there, buried under tons of concrete. And if by some crazy chance it was something paranormal, I just hope that destroying the building finally brought whatever was down there some peace.
The next story. As great as the end of the school year is, there is honestly nothing better than the massive parties that follow the end of the spring semester. After high school graduation, pretty much my entire friend group scattered across the state and beyond for college. I ended up going to a university that was a solid 8-hour drive away, 2 states over. So by the time finals week wrapped up, I was absolutely losing my mind with excitement to get back home, see my boys, and more importantly, party it up. We had already planned this absolute banger of a party at my friend Logan's house. Logan's parents were incredibly well off and owned this massive mansion basically in the middle of nowhere. It had a huge pool, an enormous backyard with a bonfire pit, and tons of bedrooms for people to crash in. It was the quintessential ideal location for a rager, especially because his parents were going out of town the exact weekend we all got back. It felt like the stars were aligning for all of us degenerates. The afternoon before the party started, I met up with Logan and a few of our close friends at the local mall. We grabbed some food and started trading stories about our freshman year college experiences. Or, to be more accurate, we were bragging about how insane the party scenes were at our respective schools. While we were talking, Logan suggested a way to spice things up for the night. He said, "Hey, what if we make tonight a costume party?"
Honestly, it sounded like a weird idea for the end of May, but Logan's logic was that since we were all away at our different colleges during Halloween and couldn't celebrate together, this was going to be our make-up Halloween party. It didn't take much to convince us. We immediately blasted it out on social media and group chats, telling people to throw together whatever costumes they could find on short notice. People absolutely loved the idea. I went down to my parents' basement, found a cheap plastic Jason Voorhees hockey mask from an old costume, and decided I'd just go as Casey Jones. By 10 p.m. that night, people started shuffling in packs through Logan's front doors, loaded up with drinks and rocking the most makeshift costumes you've ever seen. The Purge movies were pretty new around this time, so naturally, a solid 70% of the girls showed up wearing some variation of a Purge outfit. Before we even realized what was happening, the party got completely out of hand. Way more people showed up than we had actually invited. Word had spread fast, and since Logan's parents weren't home and there were literally no neighbors around to call in a noise complaint, Logan didn't care. He just kept letting random crowds through the door. Eventually, the house was so packed and there were so many masks everywhere that I honestly had no clue who was even at the house anymore, outside of my core group of friends. A few hours into the night, around 1:30 a.m., I was acting like a total fool out on the back deck, telling some loud, drunken stories to a circle of guys. At one point, I happened to look up past the deck and into the house through the massive glass sliding doors. Standing just inside the living room was a girl. She was wearing this incredibly elegant, bright gold masquerade ball mask. In the flashing party lights, that gold mask was catching every single reflection. But the weird part was that she was standing completely alone in the middle of a crowded room, and she was staring directly at me through the glass. I kind of blinked, raised my hand, and waved at her. Very slowly, she raised her hand and waved right back, sipping something out of a red Solo cup. I nudged one of my buddies on the deck and asked, "Hey, do you know who that girl in the gold mask is?" My friend looked over, shrugged, and said, "Man, I have no idea. A ton of randoms from the next town over showed up a bit ago. She's probably with them." Being a little drunk and full of confidence, I decided to go inside and strike up a conversation with her. But the second I stepped through the sliding door and started walking her way, she turned around and melted right into the thick crowd toward the back hallway. By the time I navigated through the people, she was completely gone. I did a quick lap around the main floor, but didn't see the gold mask anywhere. I figured she was playing some sort of game, but I didn't want to come off as a total creep by hunting her down, so I just headed back outside. Fast forward a couple of hours later, it was around 3:30 in the morning. The party was finally starting to wind down. A lot of people had driven home, and others were passed out on the couches inside. A few of us who were still awake decided to do something stupid and jumped straight into the pool. For whatever reason, I still hadn't taken off my cheap plastic hockey mask. While I was floating in the water, trying to fight off a head buzz, I looked past the edge of the pool toward the backyard. Logan's property didn't have a fence. It was just a massive manicured lawn that stretched out into a dark, incredibly dense tree line that led into a state forest. And right there, walking across the grass entirely by herself, was the girl in the gold masquerade mask. She was heading straight for the trees. I sat up in the pool and cupped my mouth around my mouth, shouting at her, but between the ambient music still playing from the house and the distance, she didn't hear me. It didn't help that I didn't know her name, so I was just yelling random gibberish like, "Hey, Gold Mask, wait up!" Right as she reached the very edge of the woods, she suddenly stopped. She turned around and looked directly back at the pool. Even though she was a good distance away, the moonlight was reflecting perfectly on that bright gold plastic. She raised her hand, waved at me one more time, and then hooked her index finger, gesturing me to follow her into the dark woods. Fueled by pure adrenaline and stupid teenage curiosity, I didn't even think twice. I jumped out of the pool and sprinted across the wet grass toward the tree line. To give you an idea of just how deep Logan's yard was, by the time I actually reached the edge of the woods, I could barely hear the bass from the house. It was dead silent out there. I stepped up to the first row of trees, peering into the pitch black, and said, "Hey, are you out here? Look, I don't want to creep you out, but you told me to follow you." I was scanning the darkness, looking for any glint of gold. After about 2 minutes of standing there, I started shivering uncontrollably. I had sprinted out of a heated pool in late May, so I was currently standing at the edge of a dark forest with no shirt, no shoes, soaking wet, wearing nothing but a pair of swim shorts and a Cesta plastic Jason mask. I said, "All right, look, I'm freezing. I'm going to head back to the house." I turned my back to the woods, preparing to walk away, when a soft, quiet female voice cut through the dark from just a few yards inside the brush. She said, "Don't go back yet. Come and find me first."
That voice was all I needed to hear. My stupid ego completely overrode my common sense. I turned back around and stepped into the brush, saying, "I literally can't see a thing out here. Where are you?" Right then, I heard a heavy branch snap deep to my left. But a split second later, her voice came from my right. She giggled, sounding incredibly flirtatious, and said,
I'm right over here. You look so cold. I can warm you up." Looking back, it was the most obvious trap-like dialogue straight out of a B-grade horror movie, but in that moment, it worked on me perfectly. I took another 10 steps into the dark, following the sound. Suddenly, my foot hit something plastic. I looked down and saw the gold masquerade mask lying right there on the dirt. I bent down and picked it up, completely bewildered. I kept walking a little further, completely invested in this weird little game. And then, finally, I saw her silhouette standing near a massive oak tree. It was way too dark to make out her facial features, but she was wearing a white tank top, black shorts, and her long dark hair was completely draped over the front of her face. I tried to play it cool, holding up the mask, and said, "Hey, I found your mask. By the way, my name's Kip." I started walking the final few feet toward her, but she didn't move an inch. She didn't even extend her arm to take the mask from my hand. She just kept her head tilted down, her hair completely obscuring her face. And that's when she said, in a sudden, completely flat tone, "I know exactly who you are, Kip." The second she said that, a jolt of pure ice shot straight down my spine. That voice, it wasn't the flirtatious one from a minute ago. It was a voice I recognized instantly, but my brain was violently scrambling to place where I had heard it before. I thought it was a girl from high school pulling a prank, but then she took a deliberate step backward into the shadows, and from my immediate left, the sound of branches violently snapping shattered the silence. Someone was sprinting at me full speed through the brush. Before I could even turn my head to look, a second girl burst out from behind a thick bush. She was hysterically screaming at the top of her lungs, and raised high above her head was a solid metal baseball bat. She took a massive, full-force horizontal swing straight for my temple. If I hadn't instinctively dived flat onto the dirt out of pure survival reflex, that bat would have cleanly taken my head off. I felt the wind from the metal bat pass inches from my ear. I hit the ground hard. She let out this primal, enraged shriek and brought the bat down in an overhead swing, trying to crush my skull while I was on the floor. I rolled frantically to the right, and the bat slammed into the dirt right where my chest had been. I scrambled to my feet, dropped the gold mask, and ran. I didn't look back. I just sprinted through the blinding darkness of the woods, bursting out onto Logan's lawn, screaming at the absolute top of my lungs. "Call the cops! There are fucking psychos in the woods! Someone is trying to kill me!" Bursting into the house, soaking wet, covered in mud, crying and shaking with pure adrenaline, completely killed the party instantly. Within minutes, Logan kicked every single person out of the house, except for the handful of close friends who were supposed to stay the night. I begged Logan to call 911, but he flat out refused. He was terrified of getting in trouble with his parents for throwing a massive underage drinking party that completely trashed the house. I was in no condition to drive, and my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't even hold a glass of water. I made Logan lock every single deadbolt in that house, and I spent the entire night pacing by the back windows, staring out into the pitch-black yard. The tree line was so far away that it was impossible to see if anyone was standing there, but I felt a pair of eyes watching me from the dark until the sun came up. As soon as the first light of dawn hit the sky, I got into my car and drove straight home. I spent weeks trying to process the sheer insanity of what had happened. A girl had literally traveled 8 hours across 2 state lines just to scout out a party, use her friend as bait to lure me into a dark forest, and attempt to brutally murder me with a baseball bat. I had no idea I had that kind of terrifying effect on someone. The girl with the bat was an ex-girlfriend I had dated for a grand total of 3 weeks during my first semester at college. I had ended things with her because she quickly showed signs of being completely unhinged. She constantly demanded to see my phone, wanted the passwords to my emails, and if I got back to my dorm room 2 minutes late after a lecture, she'd already be sitting on my bed waiting to interrogate me. It was way too much drama for a 3-week relationship, so I broke it off as gently as I could. I thought it was just a standard, clean breakup. I had absolutely no clue she was harboring a homicidal level of vengeance against me. I spent the rest of that entire summer looking over my shoulder every single second. Every time I saw a girl in public who even remotely resembled her, a wave of pure panic would hit me, and I'd get in my car and leave the area immediately. That night completely forced me to grow up, though. I stopped drinking completely, and I permanently quit going to wild house parties. My ex never returned to our university after that summer, and I never saw or heard from her again. But it taught me a permanent lesson. You need to be incredibly careful about who you let into your life and what you say to people. A breakup that seems completely ordinary and harmless to you might be triggering something profoundly dark and dangerous in someone else. If she had made clean contact with that metal bat that night, I wouldn't be sitting here to tell this story today.
The next story.
Last year, I landed my first long-term gig as a substitute teacher. I had been subbing all over the county for a while, but in April, one of the regular history teachers at a high school I frequently visited went out on maternity leave. I was brought in to cover her classes from April all the way until the end of the school year in late June. Honestly, my first few months there were great. If you know anything about teaching, you know that being a sub can sometimes be an absolute living nightmare depending on the school and the age group. But for this specific job, I was teaching high school seniors. By the time April hits, a lot of seniors are already feeling the heavy effects of what we call senioritis. In other words, they are completely checked out mentally. They're just waiting for graduation. Because of that, I kept my lessons brief, engaging, and fun. We were covering government, so instead of just drowning them in textbook lectures and notes, I focused more on healthy classroom debates. It ended up being incredibly rewarding. Before I knew it, final exams were over, and summer vacation was officially about to begin. The last day of school was a mandatory half-day, followed by an afternoon awards ceremony. Once the ceremony wrapped up, the seniors began slowly filtering out of the building, saying their final tearful goodbyes. I went back to my classroom alone and started cleaning up. I wanted to make sure every file was put away and the room was completely perfect for when the original teacher came back in the fall. Right as I was finishing up, the principal passed by, saw that I was still there, and asked me to walk with him to discuss my future. We ended up standing near the main exit, talking for almost an hour. He told me he was incredibly impressed with my teaching style and said he was going to pull some strings to try and hire me full-time in the fall. I was absolutely ecstatic. We walked out together, but right before I reached my car in the parking lot, I realized I had left my purse sitting back in the classroom. I said goodbye to the principal, turned around, and made my way back inside. By this time, the school was almost entirely empty. Maybe a handful of teachers were still in their rooms down the hall, but the corridors were dimly lit and dead silent. When I pushed the classroom door open, I froze. Standing right next to my desk, completely in the shadows, was one of my students. It was a brilliant but incredibly quiet kid that I'll call Ben. I cleared my throat, startled, and asked, "Ben, what are you still doing here? School let out hours ago." Ben just looked at me and shrugged. He didn't say anything at first. I walked closer and asked him if he was okay. Very quietly, in this completely flat, monotone voice, he said, "I'm fine, Miss Jones, just doing some thinking." The entire interaction felt incredibly off. The way he was just lurking in a darkened classroom by himself gave me a terrible feeling. I told him that he couldn't be in the building anymore and that, unfortunately, we both needed to leave. Ben didn't argue. He slowly turned around and started heading for the door. But right as he reached the threshold, he stopped. He didn't look back at me. He just stared straight out into the empty hallway and said, "Thank you, Miss Jones. I'm sure I'll see you around real soon." That might sound like a completely harmless parting phrase, but I wish you could have heard the tone of his voice when he said it. There was this bizarre, creepy layer of confidence to it that made my stomach drop. Once his footsteps faded down the hall, I hurried over to grab my purse so I could finally leave. I always, without fail, lock my purse inside one of the desk drawers when I leave the room. But when I looked at my desk, my purse was sitting right on the chair next to it. Instantly, my mind jumped to the worst-case scenario. I assumed Ben had been caught red-handed trying to steal something from my bag, and that's why he was acting so weird when I walked in. I frantically zipped it open and checked the inside, but everything appeared to be there. My wallet, my credit cards, and even the cash in my wallet was completely untouched. I figured his conscience must have gotten the better of him right before I walked through the door. I grabbed my bag and drove home, eventually letting the weird incident slide. A few nights later, it was a beautiful, clear summer evening. My husband and I were hanging out in the backyard, enjoying a small bonfire. Our 7-year-old son was staying the weekend over at his cousin's house, so we were just enjoying some rare, quiet time together. Around midnight, we heard this strange, distinct rustling sound coming from the dark corner of our yard, right behind our wooden tool shed. I looked at my husband and said, "Don't worry about it. It's probably just a raccoon or a stray cat. Let's just leave it alone." A few minutes later, we decided to head inside for the night. Right before stepping through the back door, my husband grabbed his flashlight and said, "Hold on, let me just make sure the padlock on the shed is secure." I went inside, headed upstairs, and started getting ready for bed. But after about 10 or 15 minutes, I noticed my husband still hadn't come upstairs. I walked back down to the kitchen, and right then he stepped through the back door. He looked visibly rattled. He looked at me and said, "So when I initially walked behind the shed, I didn't see anything, but when I walked around to the front, I noticed the heavy door was unlatched and slightly open. I shone my light inside, and there were wet, muddy footprints on the floor. I went back behind the shed to look closer, and the ground back there was completely trampled. Someone was definitely standing back there, watching us by the fire." I tried to rationalize to calm his anxiety. I told him he probably just forgot to latch the door the last time he mowed the lawn, and that the footprints were probably his own. We locked the back door and went to sleep. The next morning, I woke up before him to make some coffee. As I walked into the kitchen, I noticed that our heavy wooden back door was completely ajar. It wasn't wide open, but it was unlatched just enough that a hard gust of wind could have pushed it right in. I immediately got annoyed, assuming my husband had been so freaked out by the shed situation the night before that he had completely forgotten to check the deadbolt. I slammed it shut, locked it, and went about my day. That night, my husband stayed up late in the living room to watch a West Coast baseball game. I ended up falling asleep on the couch waiting for him. After the game ended, around 1:30 a.m., he gently woke me up and we went upstairs to bed. Once I got under the covers, for some unexplainable reason, I couldn't sleep. I kept tossing and turning, trying to get comfortable, but something just felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. The air in the house felt heavy. Call it a gut feeling or call it mother's intuition, but every nerve in my body was telling me that we were in danger. Realizing I was just going to keep waking up my husband, I decided to get out of bed, head down to the living room, and read my book until I got tired. I quietly snuck out of the bedroom, closed the door behind me, and stepped into the pitch-black hallway. I took 2 steps toward the staircase, and then I completely froze in a wave of sheer, paralyzing panic. Standing at the very end of the hallway, right outside my 7-year-old son's bedroom, was the distinct dark silhouette of a tall person. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard it felt deafening. Shaking violently, I reached my hand out to the wall and flipped on the hallway light switch. The bright overhead lights flooded the corridor, and when I saw the face of the person standing outside my 7-year-old son's bedroom, my blood went completely cold. It was Ben. My quiet, brilliant history student was standing inside my private home in the middle of the night. Ben didn't run. He didn't look panicked. He just looked directly into my eyes, let out this slow, deeply unsettling smile, and said, "Hey, Miss Jones, nice house." The second the words left his mouth, he turned, darted into my son's bedroom, and slammed the door shut behind him. In the split second before the door closed, I saw that he was tightly clutching something metallic and sharp in his right hand. A blood-curdling shriek tore out of my throat. I ran back into my bedroom, woke up my husband, and frantically dialed 911 on my phone. Hearing my screams, my husband sprinted out into the hallway and threw his entire weight against my son's bedroom door, forcing it open. As he burst into the room, he saw Ben frantically scrambling out the second-story window. My husband lunged to grab his hoodie, but Ben was too fast. He leaped straight out of the window, dropping 2 stories to the ground below. He miraculously landed on his feet and sprinted off into the dark woods behind our property. The police arrived at our house within minutes. I was hysterical, giving the officers Ben's full name, his physical description, and telling them exactly what high school he went to. 2 cruisers immediately sped off to Ben's house, but when the officers returned to our place a few hours later, what they told us made me physically sick. The officer looked at us and said, "Look, we went to the residence. Ben's parents swear up and down that he's been in his bed all night. We went up to his room, woke him up, and he claims he's been asleep for hours. Since there are no cameras on your property and we didn't catch him in the act, there is legally nothing we can do right now. Just call us if you see him again." I screamed at them, telling them I looked him dead in the eyes under full lighting, but without physical evidence or surveillance footage, the cop's hands were tied.
The next day, my husband pointed out something that entirely recontextualized the night I caught Ben in my classroom. He looked at me and said, "He didn't want your money, honey. When he took your purse out of the drawer, he went through your wallet and looked at your driver's license. He used it to memorize our home address. That's why your purse was left out on the chair." What still keeps me awake every single night is the thought of what Ben was doing outside my son's room. What was that metallic object in his hand? What would have happened if my 7-year-old had actually been sleeping in his bed that weekend instead of staying at his cousin's? God absolutely protected my boy that night. I spent the rest of the summer too terrified to let my son sleep at home. He spent almost the entire vacation staying with relatives because I couldn't handle the paranoia. We immediately changed every single lock on our doors and invested thousands of dollars in high-tech security cameras around the perimeter. As of writing this story, I have no idea where Ben is or what happened to him after graduation. He was always so polite and respectful to me in class, but behind that quiet exterior was a literal predator. If I had stayed in bed for just 10 seconds longer that night, I never would have caught him in the hallway. I can't even begin to imagine what horror we would have woken up to. We currently have our house on the market, and we're hoping to move out of state very soon. Once I'm finally away from this place, I think I'll finally be able to get a good night's sleep.